Carl Jung once documented a transformation so profound and unsettling that he considered it among the most challenging developments in human nature he had ever witnessed. He noticed that certain individuals, often empaths who appear gentle, accommodating, and even fragile, would one day reach a breaking point. For years, these individuals bent under the weight of expectation, carrying the suffering of others, absorbing conflict, and tolerating exploitation, until something inside them, finally, snapped. But rather than shatter into despair, these people began to change in ways that were both fascinating and frightening. It was as if the very qualities that once kept them bound in servitude now became the source of an extraordinary liberation. Jung believed this phenomenon was the manifestation of shadow integration, a process where all the hidden, repressed, and unacknowledged aspects of the psyche rose to the surface and demanded to be woven into the self. To those who watched, it could feel like witnessing a completely different person emerge, but Jung insisted this was not the creation of something new, it was the uncovering of what had always been there, waiting to be awakened. In the traditional view, empaths were seen as vulnerable souls destined to be drained by others. Yet Jung's insights complicated this picture. He argued that empaths were not weak at all, but rather individuals with extraordinary psychological wiring. Neuroscience today has validated much of this intuition, showing that highly sensitive people often have hyperactive mirror neurons, enabling them to perceive the emotions of others with startling intensity. This heightened perception, however, comes at a cost. They are constantly flooded with emotional stimuli, often mistaking the suffering of others for their own. This is what traps many empaths in cycles of burnout and dependency. But Jung saw something more. He saw that when an empathy reached their breaking point, when they were no longer willing to be consumed by external demands, they could ignite a process of inner alchemy. Just as the alchemists sought to transform base metals into gold, the empathy, by integrating their shadow, transformed pain and repression into power and discernment. Shadow integration, in Jung's framework, meant acknowledging and embracing the darker elements of the self: anger, assertiveness, desire, pride, qualities often suppressed in favor of being agreeable, helpful, or nurturing. Empaths in particular learned early in life that these traits were unacceptable, because they conflicted with the expectation that they should serve others quietly. But Jung argued that repressing these forces did not make them disappear. It merely buried them in the unconscious, where they grew in intensity until they erupted. The moment of eruption often frightened both the empathy and those around them, because it looked like a collapse. Yet in truth it was the threshold of transformation. By learning to welcome these shadow qualities into their conscious identity, the empathy could stop being defined by others' needs, and instead become something far rarer: a sovereign self. Jung sometimes described this emergence as if the individual had become twice born, carrying the same external face, but radiating an entirely different inner presence. What made this transformation so unsettling was not only its intensity, but its unpredictability. A person who once tolerated endless mistreatment might suddenly cut ties, speak truths that others had long feared, or set boundaries that felt immovable. In some cases, these individuals displayed an uncanny clarity, as if they could see through deception instantly. What outsiders often mistook for cruelty or detachment was in fact the empathy, finally, recognizing their own worth, and refusing to abandon themselves. This process, Jung suggested, was not just therapeutic, but revolutionary. It allowed the individual to reclaim psychic energy that had been trapped in repression, and redirect it toward creative, protective, and transformative ends. To illustrate this, imagine a devoted employee in a toxic workplace, someone who quietly absorbs the extra tasks, soothes conflicts among colleagues, and sacrifices personal time to keep the system running. At first, their managers praise them for being dependable, and co-workers confide in them because they are compassionate. But over time, the constant exploitation takes its toll. The employee begins to feel hollow, disconnected, and physically exhausted. Eventually, something shifts. Perhaps a final insult, a project stolen, a dismissal of their efforts, or a moment of betrayal pushes them past the breaking point. To the surprise of everyone, the same person who once said yes to everything begins to say no with unwavering authority. They refuse extra work, call out injustices openly, and in some cases, even walk away entirely. Colleagues may whisper that they have changed, but in truth they have not changed, they have awakened. What has emerged is the integrated shadow, the assertive force that was always within them, hidden beneath layers of accommodation. Jung warned that this process was not without risk. Integration is not the same as indulgence. To simply unleash anger without reflection is to become consumed by it. True shadow integration requires balancing the recognition of one's darker impulses with the conscious choice to channel them wisely. For the empathy, this means transforming suppressed rage into boundary setting, turning fear into discernment, and transmuting grief into compassion with clarity. When this balance is achieved, the empathy ceases to be a passive absorber of pain, and becomes instead a healer who can withstand the weight of others without losing themselves. The most disturbing aspect, Jung noted, was how society reacted to these awakenings. Systems built on exploitation, be it family dynamics, workplaces, or even cultural norms, depend on empaths remaining compliant when they awaken. These systems often retaliate, labeling the awakened empathy as selfish, cold, or dangerous. In truth, what society fears is not the empathy as shadow, but their sovereignty, for sovereignty cannot be controlled. It is this resistance from the collective that makes the process so difficult, yet it is also what makes it so necessary for Jung. The awakened empathy was not merely an individual success story, but a model of human evolution, proof that by confronting our shadow, we could become more whole, more autonomous, and, ultimately, more human. What Jung observed over decades of clinical practice, neuroscience is now beginning to echo. Empathy without boundaries is unsustainable, but empathy integrated with shadow becomes a force of resilience and clarity. The empathy who has undergone this alchemical process is no longer at the mercy of the world's chaos, but neither do they withdraw from it. Instead, they stand as a bridge, able to feel deeply without drowning, able to love without erasure, and able to protect without aggression. This paradox, softness merged with strength, is what makes the awakened empathy such a rare and powerful presence. In this way, part 1 of the journey is not only about breaking free from traps, but about redefining what it means to be empathetic at all. The empathy ceases to be a passive character in someone else's story, and instead becomes the author of their own. And while this transformation may be unsettling to witness, it carries within it the possibility of revolution, not only for the individual, but for the culture that surrounds them. Jung saw in these awakened ones the seeds of a future psychology, a path toward wholeness, that could challenge the unconscious patterns of society itself. The breaking point, then, is not an end, but the beginning of a process that reshapes identity, restores vitality, and reclaims the shadow as an ally rather than an enemy. The process of transformation that Jung described does not happen in a single explosive moment, but rather unfolds in stages, each of which demands the individual to shed illusions, confront discomfort, and reclaim pieces of themselves long buried. While the breaking point initiates the awakening, it is only the first threshold. What follows is a longer journey of recognition, integration, and sovereignty. Recognition is the first stage, where the empathy realizes that the endless suffering they carry does not belong entirely to them. For many, this realization is staggering, like the sudden awareness that they have been living inside a hall of mirrors, where every reflection was distorted. The empathy begins to see the invisible strings that tied them to others' moods and expectations. They notice patterns of manipulation that once felt like ordinary interactions, a friend's subtle guilt-tripping, a partner's need for constant reassurance, or a colleague's habit of shifting blame. These behaviors, once tolerated or excused, are now exposed in sharp relief. Recognition is both liberating and terrifying, because it forces the empathy to admit how much of their life has been shaped not by choice, but by unconscious compliance. The second stage, integration, is even more demanding. Here, the empathy confronts the very qualities they once disowned: anger, ambition, sexual desire, pride, even selfishness. These are not evils to be purged, but energies to be acknowledged and redirected. Jung believed that without this step, no true growth was possible, because the shadow is not simply a personal burden, but a reservoir of vitality. For the empathy, integration means learning to say no without apology, to assert needs without guilt, and to accept that boundaries are not betrayals, but necessities. This stage often involves messy trial and error. The newly awakened empathy may overcorrect, expressing anger too harshly, or withdrawing too suddenly. Yet these missteps are not failures. They are calibrations, attempts to find balance. After years of repression, integration is like relearning how to walk after a lifetime of crawling. It is awkward, uncomfortable, and deeply human. The final stage, sovereignty, is where the empathy emerges as something fundamentally different, no longer a sponge absorbing the emotions of others, but a mirror capable of reflecting truth without distortion. Sovereignty does not mean detachment or coldness. It means wholeness. The sovereign empathy is able to discern the difference between compassion and codependency, between generosity and self-erasure. They can sit with another's pain without drowning in it, and they can love without sacrificing their own identity. Jung considered sovereignty the true fruit of shadow integration, because it represented a state where the conscious and unconscious no longer warred with each other, but worked in harmony. This sovereignty is not a crown bestowed by others, but a quiet authority that radiates from within. To understand these stages more vividly, it helps to imagine them in everyday scenarios. Take the workplace predator, for example, the manager who preys on empathetic employees by exploiting their sense of duty. In the stage of recognition, the empathy begins to notice the subtle manipulations being praised for their team spirit whenever they work unpaid overtime, or being guilted into fixing problems caused by others. At first, this awareness is unsettling, as though the veil has been lifted, and the office suddenly looks more like a battlefield than a family. During integration, the empathy experiments with new responses. They decline extra work, they refuse to cover for others, and, though their voice may shake, they begin to insist on fairness. These acts may be met with resistance, even hostility, but they are signs of growth. By the time sovereignty takes root, the empathy is no longer afraid. They either command respect within the system or, if the environment proves too toxic, they walk away with dignity intact, no longer shackled by invisible chains. Consider also the family manipulator, perhaps a parent who cloaks control in the language of sacrifice. The empathic child grows up believing they owe endless loyalty, that their role is to soothe the parent's disappointments and carry unspoken burdens. Recognition comes when the adult child sees how much of their life has been dictated by guilt, how their decisions about career, relationships, or even daily habits were shaped by fear of disapproval. Integration means confronting uncomfortable truths, anger at the parent, grief for lost autonomy, and a determination to reclaim their own path. Sovereignty emerges when the empathy can engage with the parent without collapsing into the old role, when they can offer love freely, but not at the cost of selfhood. In romantic relationships, the dynamic can be even more consuming. The empathy may attract partners who unconsciously sense their capacity to absorb pain. A narcissistic partner, for instance, may project insecurities onto the empathy who willingly takes them in. Believing love means endless tolerance. Recognition is the shattering moment when the empathy sees that what they thought was intimacy was in fact exploitation. Integration follows as they begin to set boundaries, endure conflict, and sometimes choose separation rather than submission. Sovereignty is achieved when they enter new relationships, not as caretakers, but as equals, capable of giving and receiving without losing themselves. Jung believed these scenarios revealed a deeper truth, that shadow integration is not just a private transformation, but a challenge to collective systems. Every awakened empathy becomes a disruption to the status quo. Workplaces, families, and relationships often rely on unspoken contracts of silence and compliance, and when one person refuses to play along, the entire structure trembles. This is why society often resists the awakening of empaths, labeling them as rebellious, ungrateful, or selfish. But Jung insisted that this resistance is proof of progress. The very discomfort others feel is a sign that the empathy is no longer complicit in unconscious patterns. What makes this process so extraordinary is not only its psychological depth, but its spiritual resonance. The empathist journey mirrors ancient archetypes, the hero descending into the underworld, the alchemist laboring in the dark, the initiate facing trials before emerging transformed. Each stage recognition, integration, sovereignty is both personal and universal. Echoing the eternal drama of growth through suffering, Jung saw in these stories the collective unconscious speaking, reminding us that individual transformation always carries collective meaning. When one empathy awakens, it ripples outward, inspiring others to question their own chains. Modern psychology and neuroscience have only reinforced the wisdom of Jung's insights. Studies on emotional intelligence show that self-awareness and boundary setting are critical for sustainable empathy. Trauma research reveals how unprocessed pain is transmitted across generations, explaining why family patterns of manipulation are so difficult to break. Social psychology demonstrates how group dynamics exploit the compliant, underscoring the necessity of sovereignty. What Jung intuited through observation science now confirms: empathy without integration leads to collapse, but empathy fused with shadow produces resilience and clarity. Thus, part 2 of the journey reveals that awakening is not an end, but a passage. To move from recognition to integration, to sovereignty, is to rewrite the script of one's life. It is to step out of roles imposed by others, and into an identity forged from within. The empathy who once lived as a vessel for others' pain becomes an architect of their own destiny. And while the road is fraught with conflict, the reward is profound: the ability to feel deeply without being destroyed, to give freely without being drained, and to love without losing oneself. This is the true revolution. Jung foresaw the transformation of the wounded empathy into the sovereign healer, a figure who embodies both compassion and power, and whose very presence challenges the unconscious systems of the world. If Part 1 revealed the breaking point and Part 2 outlined the stages of transformation, then Part 3 must explore what this awakening means, beyond the individual, how the empathist shift ripples into families, workplaces, societies, and even the collective psyche. Jung often insisted that psychology is never just private. It is cultural, mythological, even spiritual. He once wrote that the world hangs by a thin thread, and that thread is the psyche of man. When empaths awaken, they are not only rescuing themselves from cycles of manipulation, they are tugging at that thread, unraveling, and rewebbing the fabric of human connection. The collective implications begin in small, intimate settings. When a formerly compliant child sets boundaries with a manipulative parent, the entire family system is forced to confront truths it long avoided. When an employee refuses to absorb toxic workplace dynamics, the organization must either adapt or fracture. These moments may appear minor, but they echo through the collective unconscious like tremors before an earthquake. Jung believed that each act of individuation, the process of becoming one's authentic self, added to the collective evolution of humanity. Thus, the empathist journey is not simply about survival. It is about shifting the very patterns that structure relationships across generations. This collective disruption explains why the awakened empathy is so often met with hostility or confusion. They have stopped playing the role that kept others comfortable. A family that relied on the empathy as mediator, scapegoat, or caretaker now faces chaos because the glue has dissolved. A workplace that thrived on silent compliance finds itself destabilized when the empathy says no. Even friendships can strain, as the awakened empathy no longer entertains endless drama, or one-sided exchanges. To the unconscious system, this new clarity feels like betrayal. To the empathy, it is liberation. Jung would argue that this tension is not evidence of failure, but of progress, what he called the tension of opposites. Growth always generates friction, and the greater the transformation, the louder the resistance. The awakened empathy also embodies what might be called the empathic paradox. The more they integrate their shadow, the more compassionate they become, but that compassion is sharpened with discernment. They no longer confuse empathy with enablement. They can listen deeply, yet refuse to fix what is not theirs to fix. They can love fiercely, yet walk away when love becomes exploitation. This paradox is precisely what makes them terrifying to narcissists, and liberating to those who seek genuine connection. A narcissist thrives in fog, in blurred boundaries, in unconscious compliance. The awakened empathy is pure clarity, a mirror held up to manipulation. In that mirror, narcissists see not only their tactics exposed, but their own unresolved wounds reflected back at them. For many, this is unbearable. But there is another layer to Jung's insight, the danger of inflation. When empaths, first, awaken, they may feel a surge of power, almost intoxicating. For years, they believed they were powerless victims of others' needs. Now they see through deception, they sense hidden motives, they feel almost prophetic. Jung warned that such moments can lead to what he called ego inflation, the belief that one's awakening makes them superior, untouchable, or even chosen. This is a dangerous trap. The purpose of individuation is authenticity, not superiority. The sovereign empathy must remember that their journey, though hard won, does not place them above others, but simply allows them to live in truth. Humility becomes the safeguard against turning their gifts into new weapons. The highest form of awakened empathy, then, is what Jung might call conscious compassion. This is not the naive compassion that accepts abuse, nor the self-righteous compassion that seeks to prove superiority. It is a mature compassion that sees others clearly, flaws, shadows, wounds, and still chooses to respond with humanity, but never at the cost of selfhood. Conscious compassion allows the empathy to help without rescuing, to love without erasing themselves, and to stand firm without becoming cruel. In this state, the empathy is both healer and warrior, both gentle and formidable. They embody what Jung described as the union of opposites, the transcendent function where contradictions reconcile into wholeness. When we extend this vision outward, the awakened empathy becomes a revolutionary archetype. Imagine a society where empaths, once silenced and exploited, begin to claim sovereignty en masse. Families would no longer perpetuate cycles of scapegoating. Workplaces would have to reform toxic cultures because the silent absorbers have withdrawn. Politics too would shift, because manipulation thrives only when people abandon their inner compass. An empathic electorate that refuses to be swayed by fear or shame could radically alter the course of nations. This may sound idealistic, but Jung himself believed that individual psychological growth inevitably impacts the collective unconscious. Every person who integrates their shadow makes it easier for the next person to do the same. Consciousness spreads not through preaching, but through example. Of course, such revolutions are not easy. The awakened empathy often finds themselves isolated, at first, accused of being selfish, cold, or rebellious. They may lose relationships that once felt central to their identity. They may face backlash from systems invested in their silence. Yet these losses, painful as they are, clear space for something greater, the creation of conscious communities. Jung saw this possibility in the archetype of the wounded healer who, once healed, could guide others. When awakened empaths find each other, they create networks of authenticity, spaces where love is not exploitation, but mutual growth. These communities become models for the future, demonstrating that human connection can thrive without manipulation. What, then, is the true danger of the awakened empathy? It is not that they wield cruelty, or dominance. It is that they expose the unconscious agreements that underlie much of human interaction. They refuse to absorb unspoken projections. They refuse to carry generational trauma unchallenged. They refuse to validate systems built on emotional exploitation. Their refusal is like pulling the power cord from a machine. The noise stops, the gears grind to a halt, and suddenly the system is revealed for what it is: fragile, dependent, unsustainable. Narcissists fear this refusal because it strips them of control, but society fears it too, because it threatens the very structures that depend on silence, compliance, and self-erasure. The empathy's ultimate weapon is withdrawal, not attack. Jung called this psychological nonviolence. Instead of fighting the narcissist on their battlefield, the empathy simply refuses to play. They do not absorb, they do not explain, they do not defend. They become immune. This immunity is not coldness, but clarity, the ability to witness manipulation without being entangled. It is the stillness of a mountain in the face of a storm, and in that stillness the storm exhausts itself in the end. The awakened empathy embodies Jung's most profound insight, that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. Their journey is not about revenge or superiority, but about authenticity. They prove that sensitivity was never weakness, that deep feeling was never a flaw, that empathy, when integrated, is not a liability, but a superpower. They show us that love and strength are not opposites, but allies, that compassion and boundaries can coexist, and that healing oneself is inseparable from healing the world. If you, listening now, have felt too much, carried too much, or lost yourself in others, remember this: the world does not need you to shrink, it needs you to awaken. The narcissist feared your clarity because they knew that, once you saw, you could never unsee. Once you valued yourself, you could never be devalued. Once you owned your power, you could never be controlled. This is the empathic revolution Jung foresaw: a quiet, steady, unstoppable wave of consciousness, that begins in one heart, and spreads to all. And perhaps the most radical act you can take is the simplest: to stop dimming your light, for the comfort of others, and to live fully and unapologetically as yourself.